Uncovering the truth is the primary duty of every detective, but for Holmes, his work has never been just about finding the truth. Even though he is the best detective I know, he has had several failures. One of the most notable occurred during the case of a scandal in Bohemia, in which he was outwitted by the woman, Irene Adler. None of them, however, present such singular features as the strange train of circumstances which I have now taken up my pen to describe. The sins committed by a person in their youth, no matter how far they run or how long they try to escape, will one day come back to haunt them, even if they have long since repented. Some sinister matters not only make the perpetrator pay the price, but also bring suffering upon their loved ones, creating even greater tragedies. It was in the latter days of September, and the equinoctial gales had set in with exceptional violence. Our new client, John Openshaw, came to visit us on such a day and shared a mysterious and inexplicable chain of events that had occurred in his family. The first victim was his uncle, Elias Openshaw, which marked the commencement of the affair. Elias emigrated to America as a young man and became a planter in Florida. Later, during the Civil War, Elias fought in Jackson's army, and afterward under Hood. When Lee laid down his arms, Elias returned to his plantation, where he stayed for 3 or 4 years. Around 1869 or 1870, he came back to Europe with a considerable fortune and settled on a small estate in Sussex, near Horsham. He lived a reclusive life, preferring solitude. Apart from his nephew, John, he avoided much social interaction. John gradually acted as Elias's representative both with the servants and with the tradespeople. By the time John was 16, he had practically taken charge of the household, except for a lumber room in the attic. With a boy's curiosity, John had peeped through the keyhole, but he never saw more than the expected collection of old trunks and bundles. This peaceful life continued until March 1883, when a letter postmarked from Pondicherry arrived for Elias. Inside, there was no letter, only 5 little dried orange pips. Yet, this seemingly innocuous package filled Elias with overpowering terror.
KKK! My God, my sins have overtaken me.
John, who was palpitating with horror, took up the envelope and saw scrawled in red ink upon the inner flap, just above the gum, the letter K 3 times repeated. There was nothing else save the 5 dried pips. At that moment, John saw his uncle descending the stairs, clutching an old rusty key in one hand, which clearly belonged to the attic, and a small brass box, resembling a cash box, in the other. Elias's face was pale, and his usual stern demeanor was replaced by an expression of dread, which made an impression on young John, though he did not fully understand the gravity of the situation at the time. Sensing that something ominous was on the horizon, Elias summoned his trusted lawyer. In John's presence, he completed and signed his will. The terms were clear. Upon his death, all his property would pass to his brother, who was John's father, and eventually, John would inherit everything. John still vividly remembers his uncle's remark about the substantial inheritance.
If you can enjoy it in peace, well and good. If you find you cannot, take my advice, my boy, and leave it to your deadliest enemy. I am sorry to give you such a two-edged thing, but I can't say what turn things are going to take.
The fire was burning brightly, and in the grate there was a mass of black, fluffy ashes, as of burned paper, while the brass box stood open and empty beside it. As John glanced at the box, he noticed, with a start, that upon the lid was printed the treble K, which he had read in the morning upon the envelope. At that time, John was convinced that the strange envelope was somehow connected to an incident from his uncle's past. 7 weeks passed and nothing happened to disturb the usual routine of their lives, until there came a night when Elias made one of those drunken sallies from which he never came back. John eventually found him face downward in a little green-scummed pool, which lay at the foot of the garden. There was no sign of any violence, and the water was but 2 feet deep, so that the jury, having regard to his known eccentricity, brought in a verdict of suicide. Everything unfolded just as Elias had feared. No one believed John's statement, not even his father, who was Elias's brother. They treated the matter as cock and bull story, and the family took over the Horsham property, until one day, John's father received a letter similar to the one his uncle had received, containing 5 dried orange pips. The paper instructed, put the papers on the sundials, and, crucially, it had KKK written inside the envelope. John advised his father to follow the instructions in the letter, but his father dismissed it as nonsense. Tragically, 3 days after receiving the letter, while his father was visiting an old friend, he had fallen over one of the deep chop pits and passed away. As usual, the police found no signs of foul plot, and the jury had no hesitation in bringing in a verdict of death from accidental. In this sinister way John came into his inheritance, and 2 years and 8 months have elapsed since then.
I had begun to hope that this curse had passed away from the family, and that it had ended with the last generation. I had begun to take comfort too soon, however. Yesterday morning the blow fell in the very shape in which it had come upon my father.
The young man took from his waistcoat a crumpled envelope, and turning to the table, he shook out upon it 5 little dried orange pips. As evening drew in, the wind had screamed, and the rain had beaten against the windows. The storm grew higher and louder, like untamed beasts in a cage. The chilling story, however, told by this young man impacted us far more than the terrible weather outside. We watched as the young man sank his face into his thin, white hands, his despair and horror palpable.
To tell the truth, I have felt helpless. I have felt like one of those poor rabbits when the snake is writhing towards it. I seem to be in the grasp of some resistless, inexorable evil, which no foresight and no precautions can guard against.
Sherlock Holmes meticulously examined the letters received by John under the lamp, his expression solemn.
It is really 2 days since you had the letter. We should have acted before this. Before I give you specific advice to save your life, do you have any thoughts on the instruction to place the papers on the sundials written on the letters addressed to you and your father?
There is one thing.
John rummaged in his coat pocket, and, drawing out a piece of discolored, blue-tinted paper, he laid it out upon the table.
On the day when my uncle burned the papers, I observed that the small unburned margins which lay amid the ashes were of this particular color. I found this single sheet upon the floor of his room, and I am inclined to think that it may be one of the papers which has perhaps fluttered out from among the others, and in that way has escaped destruction. The writing is undoubtedly my uncle's.
Holmes moved the lamp, and we both bent over the sheet of paper, which showed by its ragged edge that it had indeed been torn from a book. It was headed, March, 1869, and beneath were the following enigmatical notices. 4th, Hudson came, same old platform. 7th, set the pips on Macaulay, Paramore, and John Swain, of St. Augustine. 9th, Macaulay cleared. 10th, John Swain cleared. 12th, visited Paramore, all well. After jotting the account down in his notebook, Holmes folded up the paper and returned it to our visitor.
And now you must on no account lose another instant. We cannot spare time even to discuss what you have told me. You must get home instantly and act.
What shall I do?
There is but one thing to do. It must be done at once. You must put this piece of paper which you have shown us into the brass box which you have described. You must also put in a note to say that all the other papers were burned by your uncle, and that this is the only one which remains. You must assert that in such words as will carry conviction with them. Having done this, you must at once put the box out upon the sundial, as directed. Do you understand?
Entirely.
Do not lose an instant, and, above all, take care of yourself in the meanwhile, for I do not think that there can be a doubt that you are threatened by a very real and imminent danger. How do you go back?
By train from Waterloo.
It is not yet 9. The streets will be crowded, so I trust that you may be in safety, and yet you cannot guard yourself too closely.
I am armed.
That is well. Tomorrow I shall set to work upon your case.
Under the assurance of my companion, John seemed relieved and at ease. He shook hands with us and followed Holmes' instructions to catch the evening train. Sherlock Holmes sat for some time in silence. Then he lit his pipe, and leaning back in his chair, I knew he was worried about the safety of the young man who had just visited us.
Have you formed any definite conception as to what these perils are?
There can be no question as to their nature.
Then what are they? Who is this KKK, and why does he pursue this unhappy family?
You remember when I mentioned the qualities essential for the ideal reasoner in the early days of our friendship? Extraordinary observation, rigorous deduction, and ample knowledge. For instance, consider the KKK. While it might seem unfamiliar to us Britons, given the background of our client's uncle, Watson, please hand me the letter K from the American Encyclopedia which stands upon the shelf beside you. Thank you. Here it is. On this page, you'll find an entry about the Ku Klux Klan. With that, you should have a good understanding of this case.
In short, the Ku Klux Klan was an organization formed by some ex-Confederate soldiers in the southern states after the Civil War. They employed various methods to create accidents and deal with voters they disapproved of, despite numerous efforts by the U.S. government to eradicate them. The organization flourished. One of their distinguishing features was sending a letter containing orange pips to their targets as a warning before taking action. If someone braved the matter out, death would unfailingly come upon him, usually in some strange and unforeseen manner.
You will observe that the sudden breaking up of the society was coincident with the disappearance of Openshaw from America with their papers. It may well have been cause and effect. It is no wonder that he and his family have some of the more implacable spirits upon their track.
Then the page we have seen
is such as we might expect. It ran, if I remember right, sent the pips to A, B, and C, that is, sent the society's warning to them. Then there are successive entries that A and B cleared, or left the country, and finally that C was visited, with, I fear, a sinister result for C.
However, how can you be certain that our young visitor will soon face the relentless persecution from this organization?
Did you remark the postmarks of those letters that lad showed us?
The first was from Pondicherry, the second from Dundee, and the third from London.
Exactly, and there can be no doubt that the strong probability, is that the writer was on board of a ship. And now let us consider another point. In the case of Pondicherry, 7 weeks elapsed between the threat and its fulfillment. In Dundee it was only some 3 or 4 days. Does that suggest anything?
A greater distance to travel.
But the letter had also a greater distance to come.
Then I do not see the point.
There is at least a presumption that the vessel in which the man or men are is a sailing ship. I think that those 7 weeks or 3 days represented the difference between the mail boat which brought the letter and the sailing vessel which brought the writer. And now you see the deadly urgency of this new case, and why I urged young Openshaw to caution. Remember, this one comes from London, and therefore we cannot count upon delay.
At this point, all we could do was send our best wishes to John, hoping he made it home safely and carried out what Holmes has instructed him to do, so that he might avoid further death threats. However, our fears ultimately came true. The next day's headline, Tragedy near Waterloo Bridge, prominently featured the tragic news of Miss John Openshaw's fatal accident. We sat in silence for some minutes, Holmes more depressed and shaken than I had ever seen him. Yet, until the end of breakfast and our parting, he hadn't uttered a word. However, I knew very well that he was already planning something to seek justice for our young visitor. It was nearly 10 o'clock before Holmes entered, looking pale and worn. He walked up to the sideboard, and tearing a piece from the loaf, he devoured it voraciously, washing it down with a long draught of water, as if he hadn't bitten anything all day. Indeed, that was the truth. He had spent the entire day tracking down the object of his vengeance, narrowing it down to a sailing ship, Lone Star, of American origin, which had already departed from London by the early tide this morning.
I have them in the hollow of my hand. Young Openshaw shall not long remain unavenged. Why, Watson, let us put their own devilish trademark upon them.
With those words, my companion took an orange from the cupboard, and tearing it to pieces, he squeezed out the pips upon the table. Of these he took 5 and thrust them into an envelope. Then he sealed it and addressed it to Captain James Calhoun, Bark Lone Star, Savannah, Georgia.
By the time that their sailing ship reaches Savannah, the mailboat will have carried this letter, and the cable will have informed the police of Savannah that this bastard and his accomplices are badly wanted here upon a charge of murder.
There is ever a flaw, however, in the best laid of human plans. We waited long for news of the Lone Star of Savannah, but none ever reached us. We did at last hear that somewhere far out in the Atlantic, a shattered stern post of a boat was seen swinging in the trough of a wave, with the letters LS carved upon it. And that is all which we shall ever know of the fate of the Lone Star.